It is February of 1676, and a battle rages among an array of burning wigwams. Men caught in a ferocious melee swarm the camp as blood flows freely onto the snow, staining it red. However, this is not a battle of Europeans against Native Americans, for the Mohawk have chosen their side. Governor of New York Edmund Andros had warned the Mohawk that Metacom was coming to their territory to attempt to form an alliance. But what Metacom did not know was that he was walking into an ambush. Metacom's warband was decimated by the Mohawk. Metacom fled back to New England, having lost 50 men in the ambush. Despite Metacom's misfortune, raids would continue throughout New England. In February of 1676, the town of Lancaster, Massachusetts, was attacked by native forces, and a woman by the name of Mary Rowlandson would be taken captive. She wrote on the event in her account, a narrative of the captivity of Mary Rowlandson. At length they came and beset our own house, and quickly it was the dolefullest day that mine eyes ever saw. Mary's account is an example of a captivity narrative, which was used by the colonial governments as a form of war propaganda. Mary's daughter died from infection a week after the attack, and she was held captive for 3 months, after which Mary and her surviving children were ransomed for £20, with increased Mathers writing on the subject in his private notes. This day, Mrs. Rowlandson was by wonderful hand of Providence returned to her husband after she had been about 11 weeks in the hands of the Indians. However, no matter how bad the natives may have treated colonist captives, native captors were treated far worse by colonial authorities. The colonial governments of Massachusetts and Plymouth saw the native peoples not as sovereign nations fighting for their survival, but as common criminals revolting against the crown, and treated them as such. Hundreds of native captives were executed, and hundreds more were sold into much worse fates as slaves in the South. The number of captives overwhelmed the prison systems, and courts established 24-hour guards to prevent escapes. Despite the influx of native prisoners, raids would befall the outskirts of even Boston and Plymouth themselves. On March 12th, Plymouth was attacked by a large force, with the city withstanding the assault. 2 weeks later, 3 more towns were attacked and burned, and the war even spread to Rhode Island, with Providence and Warwick both being sacked and burned. The war turned into a bloody war of attrition. The colonists began to conduct search and destroy operations, with Mathers describing one such operation. About 30 of ours had ventured to go up the river toward the falls at Deerfield, to see what Indians they could espy themselves, but coming found none. They found about 100 wigwams, and some English plundered goods, which they took and burned the wigwams. The English were trying to starve out the natives and make them surrender or turn on Metacom, while the natives were trying to burn the colonist towns one by one. Meanwhile, the praying Indians were reinstated into the colonial militia, and their knowledge of native tactics and warfare would prove to be a decisive factor. However, the praying Indians were not the only decisive factor, as Metacom now had to contend with the Mohawk to the west and the Mohicans to the south. Metacom was being chased into a corner. Metacom fled east from a group of militiamen and rangers led by a man named Captain Benjamin Church. Metacom's force had been further devastated by raids from the Mohicans, and sachems were beginning to flee his alliance and make their own peace agreements with the English. The war had become a game of cat and mouse as Church tracked Metacom across southern New England, fighting battle after bloody battle. Much resentment had been built by colonists against the natives, and this would spark many atrocities to be committed against innocent Native Americans and praying Indians. In early August, a group of 6 praying Indians, 3 women and 3 children, were massacred on Hurtleberry Hill near modern Worcester by militiamen, while these soldiers were apprehended, tried, and executed due to the intervention of colonial official Daniel Gookin. Many of these such atrocities went unpunished. By August of 1676, Metacom had returned to his ancestral home of Mount Hope in modern Bristol, Rhode Island. Metacom had been backed into a corner by Captain Church. Canonchet, sachem of the Narragansett, had been captured by the English, and, upon refusing to make peace, was executed by the Mohicans in the same fashion as his father, Miantonomy. Weetamoo died after the Battle of Taunton, where Metacom escaped with 30 of his men, while Weetamoo escaped, only to drown and have her head hoisted on a pike by Church's men. Metacom's remaining force would be ambushed by Church's men in a marsh known as Misery Swamp on August 12th of 1676. Mathers wrote on the subject. Thereupon he betook himself to flight, but as he was coming out of the swamp, an Englishman and an Indian endeavored to fire at him. The Englishman missed of his aim, but the Indian shot him through the heart, so as that he fell down dead. Metacom's head would be cut off and hoisted on a pole, much like Weetamoo's. Metacom's second in command, Anawan, escaped Misery Swamp and gathered a force of around 60 men, fleeing near the town of Retoba, Massachusetts, where the Church laid siege to his camp. However, Anawan had no intention of fighting and welcomed Church into his camp as a guest. Church wrote on his encounter with Anawan in his history of Philip's War. Now Captain Church had told Captain Anawan's company, as he ordered the Indians to tell the others, namely, that their lives should all be spared, excepting Captain Anawan's, and it was not in his power to promise him his life, but he must carry him to his masters at Plymouth, where he will entreat them for his life. Church took Anawan to Plymouth, where he did petition the Plymouth courts to spare Anawan's life, but the courts decided to have him executed anyway. Anawan's execution marks the end of the southern front of King Philip's War, and its ramifications were widespread. 1,000 colonists died in the war, but that pales in comparison to the 3,000 natives killed and countless sold into slavery over the course of the war. The actions of Massachusetts Bay Colony in illegally invading the colonies of Maine, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island without the permissions of those living there would spark a royal inquiry and eventually the revocation of Massachusetts' colonial charter by the king, sparking outrage and ending the United Colonies. However, the war continued in the north and would lead to Maine being nearly depopulated of colonists.